First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to talk here. Thank you for coming. Thank you for waiting until the end. This department is a department I have wanted to be in touch with for a number of years because of my own research and knowing what's going on here. And so as a result, I'm very delighted to be here, but I've decided to approach the talk almost in a kind of a possibility of discussion. I have a set of questions from my research that I'm hoping the school and the students could help me to understand. So to begin with, how do I do this? I only found out the topic on kind of Monday, so it's and I understand it's Kingston University, not the University of Kingston, so apologies. But so I haven't. It's a little bit about the concept of what I think landscape is, but it's mostly about one particular aspect that I'll get to sort of a third of the way through the presentation. And that particular aspect is around fences, which is this first image here. I'm interested in the kind of the landscape of the everyday. This is in Bethnal Green, and it's on a housing estate called the Maverna Housing Estate. Because nobody knows me, I thought I'd spend a little bit of time introducing myself so you get kind of a bit of a context to who I am and why I'm here, and you can kind of get a little bit of a grasp of me. I studied a little bit on the Cities program, the London School of Economics, and then I transferred to the Contemporary Urbanism course, which Cities program was in sociology, and then I transferred into geography where the contemporary urbanism was. My thesis for my dissertation was the process of enclosing open space in contemporary London. The subtitle was, "How were a city's green spaces turned black? What does the enclosure of open space on the Maverna estate reveal?" So that's my academic background, if you like. My practice background started from an activist position. I was involved from my earliest ages in an industrial city that was in a process of transformation like Detroit, but in Australia, in a place called Newcastle, which is just north of Sydney. The steel industry had just been closed down, and the city was in this process of trying to work out who it was, what it meant, where it could go. And it was also at the same time that people were starting to write about creative cities and etc. But we were very interested in working with the steel workers who were becoming unemployed, that basically being turfed off in these kind of vast spaces. Our interest was in kind of, I guess, creativity, sculpture, those kind of things. They had a lot of skills that we could sort of build a relationship with. We were also very lucky at that time that there was, I think because they were trying to work out what to do, there was money available to kind of, so they would sort of throw money at us and say, go and whatever you want to do, try and explore this concept of the creative city. So it was kind of the right place at the right time, but we came from a very clear activist position, which was around workers' rights. It was about environmentalism, and it was also about technology at that time, where there was a lot of issues around access to computers. And it's kind of a little bit of the people I worked with were kind of the Julian Assange type, who were kind of quite did amazing things and never managed to tell anybody about it. So they'd organise these events and sort of forget that people needed to come as well. So we ended up organising festivals and things there. I moved here in 2001. My activism continued here until I was kettled in on Oxford Street in 2001, and kind of it was a very intense experience. So I kind of realised that capitalism had managed to go so far that it could do this to a movement, which, I mean, we all know now, reading the papers, that all the police, etc., that had infiltrated these groups. We're now becoming aware of what was people were starting to feel was happening. So I decided to step out of that because I felt basically I was wasting my time. It was kind of pissing in the wind, if you like to. I'm sorry for using such a crass idea, but basically it was a complete waste of my energy to be doing the scale of stuff that we were doing when capitalism was in its most rampant time. So what I decided to do was educate myself, read, and have a decent job so I could afford to travel and read and do projects that I was interested in. So my first jobs were in North Kensington, where I was a community development worker. Perhaps I was naive at the time. I thought I didn't, like most people probably were about regeneration at the time. They didn't understand how significantly it was a gentrifying project, and it was. I came with a very naive belief that there was the potential to do things. North Kensington is very interesting because of its social and political history. It was the Notting Hill riots, etc. So that was it was a very interesting learning place for me. And then I moved to work in Spitalfields at a regeneration project called Cityside Regeneration, which ran on the edge of from Wapping to Bethnal Green. It was a centrally funded government project which was delivered through the local authority and then through local groups. What drew me to this project, which was particularly interesting, was the local authorities had decided to set up these local groups, so each neighbourhood could decide how to spend the money. So it was a very interesting approach that you had to address these main themes, which are around housing, education, health, built environment, job creation, etc. But the local neighbourhoods could decide how they would do that. So each Wapping had one that was based in Shadwell. Then there was one in Bethnal Green, etc. One in Whitechapel. I was based in the strategic office in Spitalfields, in an office right on the edge of the market, which is, when we left, turned into an office selling designer leather couches and now sells designer dresses. So I don't know if we did a good thing or not, but we probably I think that's very reflective of what the transformation processes that we participated in contributed to. In that period, the entire period of time where there was government funding going into that very, very thin strip of real estate on the edge of the city, we calculated within a 10-year period about £300 million of investment had gone into just this very small space. So almost you'd expect the streets to be paved in gold, because that's an enormous amount of money. What I learnt there, which was particularly interesting, was I learnt about the corruption that happens as a result of poverty. So there was a lot of issues with local groups doing basically a huge amount of corruption between themselves. They would do deals at each meeting when the funding was decided. You fund me this week, I'll fund you that week. And in North Kensington, where there was a lot of race issues, I understood them, but I didn't condone it in any particular way. I mean, the City of London was right there, and people were staring into kind of the wealthiest district of London and living in some of the most horrific conditions I've seen. And I spent a lot of time going into people's houses when we were funding the refurbishment of housing blocks, etc. So I completely understood it, but it was kind of, again, another kind of moment of, this sort of self-reflective thing of kind of trying to understand how corruption happens. In North Kensington, for example, a lot of the people I were working with were the old white working class, who were basically the racists, which I had a huge problem with. But I could understand their issue, and their issue actually wasn't about race, it was about class. It was about this constant feeling of being exploited. So after that, I thought, well, let me go and do something very therapeutic after kind of being at the coalface of these kind of issues. And I thought, well, I'll work with the River Thames. And I coordinated a strategy that goes from the Houses of Parliament to Kew Gardens as a multidisciplinary, multi-agency organisation, which it was largely set up by people that were overwhelmingly interested in landscape. But what was particularly interesting, I wasn't involved at this stage. What was particularly interesting about this strategy in comparison to the one that's upstream, that goes from Kew Gardens to Hampton Court, which is entirely landscape based. This was interdisciplinary and pushing different ideas together. So it was planning. It was about microorganisms in the Thames. It was about tourism. It was a whole range of competing interests. And basically, my job was to kind of be a peacemaker between the competing interests. So for 4.5 years, I would try and get the Environment Agency to work with the Port of London Authority that had very different interests. One was, wanting to chop down trees, because as you can see that on the bank on the right here, that's forest, which runs. This is Barnes. On the other side is Chiswick. Grew up purely out of accident, because the Port of London Authority, when the colonial project collapsed, they no longer had any money to run the docks. Or when it was collapsed, when it was overthrown, the colonial project was overthrown, the docks position reduced, so they didn't have the money to maintain it. So this was actually a tow path where this forest was. So they used to tow things along there, and there's photos from the 60s where it's completely bare. There is not a tree. But as a result, this incredible landscape has grown up, and so it was all these kind of competing interests between, and there's sort of flood defence issues behind there. Like, it was an endless process, and that for me was a really extraordinary job, where I got to work with a whole range of very interesting people, but at the same time I also learned something else through the process, which was the learning about the process of corruption through power, the interest in accumulating power. So the people I worked with in this part of London, you can see these houses down here, £7.5 million. They were not particularly interested in the document. They were, and its endeavours. They were interested in how this document could help them accumulate power. It was an avenue for them into the power structures, so they could then use this as a way to kind of go to council meetings, etc., and say, you should be doing this. And it was a very interesting process for me to observe that. So as a result of these experiences, these are some photos of it. This was one project that I worked on in East London called the Whitechapel Centre, which turned a building that looked a little bit like Detroit. It was an old school building into a community, they call them community assets. So the top 2 floors had community businesses in it, which then funded the spaces on the ground floor, which were actual community organisations. So it was set up on a not-for-profit kind of methodology. This is the sort of things that we did with the Thames project, where we did a lot of education projects, getting people out on the river, getting them to learn about the social and political history of the river, as well as its landscape. So this was one of my favourite aspects, was organising those tours. I also, at the same time, because of my interest in the political life that we have, I also did my own projects on the side. And unfortunately, I think this is where, I think it's a Mac issue, so I apologise. Some of the things I did was I worked with friends to do projects. This was an abandoned signal box on top of the viaduct in Shoreditch, Spitalfields, which has now been demolished. And so we set about, it was with an organisation or a group. Well, it was 4 individuals, but the Office for Subversive Architecture were one of the main groups of people. So we set about, basically we tried for a year to do this legally and couldn't do it legally, so we ended up just breaking in ourselves and doing it. And we transformed it into this space. We all had different reasons for doing it. For me, it was to do with a discussion around housing, around the idea of the ideal home, the way that the housing market seemed completely. This was in 2004, I think, or 2003, 2004, 2003. How the housing market seemed completely out of. It was just running kind of rampant, and there wasn't much of a political discussion about it. So that was my interest. Their interest was, I'm not entirely sure, but it was along similar lines. So we collectively came together to do this project. I was also doing.
Did you paint the inside as well?
We didn't paint the inside, but we put like a battery in there that had a timer on it with a light, so it would come on at 9 o'clock at night. What was interesting about that project was it kept getting demolished by the authorities, and we kept going back and doing it. And now, I mean, it's been demolished now because of the East London line, but we were very determined to have this discussion, try and provoke a discussion about housing and issues of housing. So another project I did where I photographed men in the city in 2005 and 2006 that wore pink shirts, and because to me my thesis was that if people could be wearing pink shirts in the city of London, the kind of most masculine environment, then something was really wrong. And it was basically, it was kind of a sign for me of overconfidence that if a man could wear a bright pink shirt, tie, that basically the city of London runs on confidence, and that it was overconfident, and it was a matter of time before it would collapse. And that thesis proved. And the other thing I was doing at the same time was setting up this organisation called ThisIsNotAGateway, which was in a response. So this was kind of in parallel to when I was studying and when I was working and doing these projects, I was setting up this. It took a long time. It took about 6 years to kind of turn the idea into a reality. Of kind of lots of discussions with people about what was needed and what would be the most useful ideas. The name comes from this kind of critique of the Thames Gateway project, which is, again, this kind of housing project in East London. It's also a discussion, or trying to provoke a discussion about this idea of gateways that exist, that are constantly told about cities, the gateway to so-and-so, the gateway to so-and-so. There's a gateway that exists in knowledge, that you go to school, and this is a gateway to another kind of thing. And we wanted to challenge this idea that gateways exist, and actually if you allow for a gate to exist, you allow for somebody to control that gate, so you're handing over your autonomy. If you choose for gates actually not to exist, which theoretically they don't actually exist, we allow for them to exist. So there's no gateway to the City of London, for example. They don't exist, but we understand what they are. We understand where our boundaries, etc. What we wanted to do was provoke a discussion about how cities and how, as ourselves, we're allowing these things to happen. How can we move beyond these kind of positions that we've taken on? So, and I also was involved in these organisations. I was very interested in the kind of the really large-scale organisations that existed in London that were doing urban projects that were interested in trying to address issues, of inequality, etc. And this is a picture of the Westway Development Trust in North Kensington, which in the 1960s the neighbourhoods basically didn't want this freeway to be built that was going to demolish 2,000 homes and create this massive divide between a very affluent and a much less affluent area in the north. And they lost that battle. It was the last freeway to be built in London because of this battle. But they said, well, if you're going to build it, at least give us the land underneath. And at the time, that was quite a victory, because otherwise it would have just had fences up it and kind of a void. And then it became this kind of very vibrant place like the slides of Portobello Market, etc. But it was a process. What was particularly interesting about this development trust was that it decided to take a business model that was quite capitalist, in that it decided to, instead of doing all community use, it would have business use. So 2/3 of it would be business that would then generate enough money to subsidise community use. It did very well for a number of years. It's since lost its way, but that's not unusual with organisations. These were the other organisations I was involved with at the time. It was the Westway Development Trust, London Citizens, which worked on living wage for cleaners in Canary Wharf, etc. Village Underground, which is the people might know the tube carriages on top of the viaduct in Shoreditch. My close friend Tom Foxcroft worked on that, where we lived together for many years and worked on that project. And Subtext, which was a literacy project in East London. So as a result of that, I was left with many questions. So I decided to leave all of that. I'd been very determined to continue with This Is Not a Gateway, and I wanted to pursue it further and have the ability to pursue this sort of set of questions that had become very urgent to me. So we set up this organisation. Well, you saw the website, but we do things like we run a festival, we publish books, we do a bunch of things. I can't really remember them now, but they're all there. And our ambition with it, maybe I'll look at my website to remind me. So we do salons, we have an annual festival, we publish books, we're establishing a library and archive, and our ambition with this project is again to create a discourse, to create a discussion. But it's all comes back to me for this particular issue. I'm sorry, I should work out how to do that. Of what I experienced through this whole process of trying to understand the landscape of enclosure, wanting to understand the social and political history of what I saw as particularly evident in London landscape, which is this continual use of fences everywhere, and why that was. As someone that grew up in Australia as well, I when I came here and I saw a fence around a park, I thought it was the antithesis of life, the opposite of existing. How could you put a fence around a park, around a green space? Why would you do that? How could that exist? How could anybody imagine that you would have a green space that you would then enclose with iron railings? So I became obsessed with it basically all the way through this process. And I'm also interested in the kind of the broader fences that exist. This is a work by Cristo in the border of Mexico and the USA, which, like most art, is often just ahead of time. This now exists as a real fence. This was in 1973, I believe. So I was interested in how the small fences that existed in the kind of pocket parks and the larger parks in London could talk about these larger fences that were starting to be built. I mean, the Berlin Wall, for example, was put up overnight. It took 12 hours to create in barbed wire. It took a longer period to concrete it. But what is it that creates the potential for these fences to exist? What's happening? This is the fence in Palestine and Israel. They call it a fence. It's really a wall. It's called the Fence Project. So again, there was these kind of things that were happening on the broader landscape that were existing on the micro landscape in front of my eyes in London. So I wanted to understand. This is again running into the water in Mexico by Cristo. This is in the actual border that exists now between. So this is the art project in the 70s. This is the reality in the 1990s and 2000s. So this is, I think, particularly interesting. Gosh, sorry about that. This is fences around the Houses of Parliament here, which never happened with the IRA, etc. And you will know down Whitehall, they have now built in sandstone completely new bomb-proof railings that separate the buildings from the street. Interestingly, they're not right on the edge of the footpath, so a car could still run into the people, but the buildings will be protected. But this I think is really interesting. This is the landscape of the 21st century, and this is what our cities are becoming. And this is just the beginning. So back to my kind of case study that I used in my thesis, which is the Maverna Estate in Bethnal Green. This is an amazing green space that is fenced off. So I'm interested in these everyday spaces that exist that are fenced off. Why is this park fenced off? I mean, it's you can jump over it, but no one ever does. What's the biopower that exists within the space? What is it in landscape architecture? What is it in landscape schools that allow for this to happen? How is this translating into reality? This is they've now somehow caught on that they're a bit hard, quite intense, these fences. So a little bit. This is in the same area of Bethnal Green. They've started to paint them green, which I guess helps a little bit, but doesn't take away the kind of. You can see that there's sort of 3 fences to get to, I think, a park, like an area that you could potentially sit in here. So it's the experience of the everyday that I'm interested in. I mean, this is the kind of madness that happens. This is just to the north of the estate. I mean, what is this? I mean, what so this is the Werner estate, and you can see between these buildings, it was built in the 1940s. It was part of the New London plan. It was very, very progressive, that there would be these massive green spaces in between the buildings. It was all the Abercrombie ideas of access to green space. That it's all Jane Jacobs kind of ideas, that you could look out to your kitchen, you can see the kids playing in these spaces in between. You know, all this kind of, these were slums that had been bombed. There was a lot of air access, all these kind of things that were quite fashionable at the time. You can see, this is the plan. You can see here that what exists now is a fence that goes, it's almost a kilometre. It's 850 metres, 2.2 metres high fence around the estate. And in between these spaces here, so these are the building blocks. These are the green spaces. They're football size. They're equivalent of a football field. It's completely fenced off. So you cannot get into, you can see here that you cannot get into them unless you're going to mow it. So there's absolutely no access at all to these spaces. And what they did, that first image that I showed, is the playground here. So they've institutionalized the idea of space by, I mean, you will have seen that first image was taken in the snow to kind of show the contrast between the black and the white. You have to go through 3 fences to get into the play area. That's after you've walked out of your unit and through a number of fences to get to this fence. One of the projects I do want to do is measure the amount of fence that you walk past from here, say, to Liverpool Street. The actual amount of kind of visual landscape that you have to walk past that is fenced. And so this is the spaces in between. I mean, you know, nice, lovely. 2.2 metre high fence that completely stops you from. So also, as you might imagine, there's very high density in these blocks with families. So there's these potential spaces where, you know, children play. This is another one. This is the typical experience on the sort of the side, is it's completely locked off. You're unable to go in them. And most of you will know when you walk around that this is common in London. The green spaces around social housing is completely fenced off. The public parks are fenced off. The royal parks are fenced off. What is it that enables that to happen? This is the contrast with the black and the white. I think it becomes really evident of the kind of the landscape that exists in the, you know, in the 21st century in London. That's to show you the scale of the fence, and you can see there's another fence inside. So this is the play area. These are the number of fences you have to go through to get into the play space. What I find interesting about that is how that's in contrast to the urban space and the whole what's become very fashionable to create permeable, accessible urban hard spaces. So these are completely open, completely, you know, the whole thing, Kensington High Street, strip away all the barriers, make everything, but something's happening where green space is being impounded, it's being enclosed further and further, but these spaces are being, you know, pushed open, made open, whereas before they weren't. That was a street before. Of course, fences have many different uses. This is opposite the Chinese embassy, making good use of a fence to protest against the enclosure of Tibet. So I started to kind of research the concept of what is it about the fence within me, which is kind of, it's a similar narrative or a similar kind of questioning. what is it about the culture here in comparison to other places where people are deciding to fence themselves. And my research findings found that there's actually no legal requirements whatsoever to have a fence anywhere, anytime, including play spaces. So, in a park, there's absolutely no requirement to have a fence around a children's play area at all, none whatsoever. The policies of today want the same things as that were wanted in 1945. It's all about healthy living, exercise, access to green space, connectivity through green space, almost identical to the 1945 agendas in the Abercrombie Plan. But no one has access to these spaces now. So the kind of measurements that people have in government policies of I think it's 500 meters to access to green space, just this impossibility. So these policies that government are wanting to do are, you could probably look at a map and say, okay, there's a green space there. And I know colleagues that I worked with at Hammersmith and Fulham Council who didn't measure this. They'd see the green space, but they didn't measure that you had to walk all the way around the park to get into it. So it wasn't 500 meters. It was, for example, that estate, it was almost more than a kilometre, or a mile, I should say. So it's contradictory to all the policies that people want. Coleman, whom you might have a lot of knowledge of, or some knowledge of, is the defensible space chap from America that was is quite popular with the police here around kind of housing estates issue of defensible space. He's not really a big influence in the UK. I mean, he's a little bit, but not really. The defensible space concept. And actually you could do the concept similarly. So for example, in the green spaces, you could actually have hedgerows against the building blocks, for example, along here, to keep people away from jumping in the windows or whatever the paranoia is, rather than having a green space in the middle. You could actually move, if you notice a lot of the parks, etc. in the UK have the kind of green in the middle, and because of the fence around it, and then it's kind of protected. I mean, that could be completely changed to enable a defensible space if that was needed. The Fencing Contractors Association sets the standard for fencing, so the kind of what's needed is set by them. When I interviewed them, they said fencing was a £1 billion annual business turnover. I don't know how that compares to other businesses. Maybe I think I hear that the City of London creates £7 billion of turnover. So it's a huge business. This kind of, and it's all associated with the militarization of space that's happening in our cities today. What's also interesting, that the difference between these spaces and the spaces, say, for example, in Notting Hill or in Islington, where people have access to the green spaces on their estates. So you can think of those round areas in Notting Hill where the gardens, they're fenced off to the public, but the residents have access to them. In their leases, they have access to the green space, that's part of it. But living on a block like that one, you have no access to that green space, so you have no rights whatsoever to be able to do anything with those spaces. So it's all these kind of technical elements as well that could be addressed to change them. Fences often cost 2/3 of the landscape project in the research that I did. For example, what's the Lincoln's Inn Field, just near the LFC, the fence there, it was £750,000 to put in a fence, which was taken down in the Second World War. There's these kind of interesting histories with fences as well. Oh, I have a sheet to hand out with some quotes. But one of the interesting things in the war, the fences were taken down in this kind of railings. Fences were taken down in this idea to they were going to melt them down and make them into weapons. And actually, what they did was dump them in the Thames. So it was, but there was this long process of these fences being open. I think I have a quote from George Orwell. in 1944, where he says, when the railings around the parks and squares were removed, the object was partly to accumulate scrap iron, but the removal was also felt to be a democratic gesture. More green spaces were now open to the public, and you could stay in the parks till all hours instead of being hounded out at closing times by grim-faced keepers. The parks were improved out of recognition by being laid open, acquiring a friendly, almost rural look that had never had before. They had, actually, because they didn't, when they were first built, they didn't have railings because the houses enclosed them. But like the railings, they were merely put there to keep the populace out. So there's these, kind of very, John Ruskin, who was writing in 1859. I want to do a contrast here between two quotes that were written at a very similar time. I'll go to the one that basically what happens with this idea of fences and borders and boundaries is a complete split between people that believe fences are very, very important and that were the creators of civilization, the idea of property ownership, and those that feel that through ownership we've basically lost everything that it was to be human. So losing our relationship with nature, the idea of kind of controlling nature, etc., was the process of kind of some people that write about it suggest that it's, the downfall. And one of the things that was particularly interesting in Britain was the enclosure of the commons in the 17th and 18th centuries, which was this, stop me if everybody knows about it, but I recently learned about it. It was this process where, because of colonialism had found new plants to grow, etc., in the countryside that they could bring to Britain, and the beginning of mechanization, the entangled relationship that existed previously with nature in Britain, and there were still landowners, but the relationship was quite entangled between who owned what, and the relationship was stripped away when they decided to enclose the commons. And what I find very, very interesting as well, instead of using barbed wire, which was available at the time, they decided to grow hedgerows. And we all know that everybody talks about how biodiverse, etc., the hedgerow is. It's really this kind of lionized idea of the hedgerow, but actually that the hedgerow represents the removal of the people from the land. And the biodiversity that existed there before is, when it was a forest, etc., is clearly much more than exists in a hedgerow. So it's these interesting processes that have happened across time, which still exist right in front of us when we look at an iron railing in front of us in front of us in London. Have I spoken too long?
You're fine. You're fine.
Sure?
Yes.
I've spoken a little bit about this, but I mean, I'll talk a little bit about the contrast between people's views of what they see as the pro and against kind of fences. So I'll read those quotes. So on the one hand, this is written in 1890 in the Beaton Book of Garden Management. The idea of enclosing land is one of the most conclusive proofs of a high state of civilization. Indeed, a history of fencing, from the rude landmarks of ancient times up to the almost perfect fences of the present day, would, to a great extent, be a history of social progress and moral advancement. So that's 1890, and then in 1859, John Ruskin, in his work called The Work of Iron, the iron railing is a useless fence. It can shelter nothing and support nothing, and besides being useless, it is an insolent fence. It says plainly to anybody who passes, you may be an honest person, but you also may be a thief. Honest or not, you shall not get in here. I am a respectable person and much above you. You shall only see what a grand place I have got to keep you out. Look here and depart with humiliation. So I think that's even interesting about the type of fences that are built, that they're not completely blocked off. There's spaces in between to kind of, it's almost like a teasing in a way. I mean, it's interesting that landscape architects I did interview had a real spectrum of ideas on this. But a chap that works on the gardens in the palace upstream. What's the palace upstream? Hampton Court. He talked about how wonderful fences and railings and etc. were because of the way that they could control behaviour, the way that they articulated how you should behave in certain spaces at certain times. And he also talked about kind of the exhilaration of kind of trespassing through a fence, like it was almost almost a sexual experience in a way, to kind of you kind of penetrated these boundaries into a new kind of calmer, nicer place. So there's really a split between, and I think, well, the kind of cliche I use for this work is there's nothing that divides us like a fence. There's those that believe it's the beginning of civilization, as I said, and there's those that believe that it's one of the things that's continuing our enclosement, our enclosure as people.
Did you interview town planners?
Sorry?
Did you interview town planners?
Yes, I did. Town planners, they've been so depoliticised recently that for example, there is no reason for any legal reason for a fence to exist in any park. But all my experience when I was working on parks on the River Thames or in East London or whatever was a fence has to go in. It was a knee-jerk reaction. There was never a possibility to not have a fence, even if you made all these arguments. And the town planners would just agree with it. They would say, because of crime and what have you, that it makes sense to do this, and it's been done before. Why, And the budgets are enormous for a fence. Absolutely enormous. And if you want to plant really lovely, landscapes, most of your budget is going to go in creating a boundary to stop people coming into it. Which is, these very interesting things that are happening. Just to kind of show an example of the political history of the fence, there was at the same time that the hedgerows were being planted and grown here, at the same time in India, the British were planting a hedgerow right in the middle, called the Great Hedge of India, which was a tax hedge. So you couldn't pass across without paying it. It was also that it was important in then starting the political movement that ended the colonial project in India. But I think we can then get a kind of a parallel knowledge of what was going on. If they were doing it there and doing it here. So these fences, these spaces have reordered British society basically, because once these spaces were enclosed of the commons, it was the very first time that there'd ever been a mobile workforce created in the history. There'd been slavery, Jews had been enslaved, slavery had existed, people had been, forcibly moved as a mobile workforce, but there had never been a mobile workforce before that was looking for work. This created the cities of the UK, which then created the Industrial Revolution, etc., where we are today. So they're very, very, very important to the social political history of landscape design. What I found through my research is I tried to go all the way back, because I was like, where does this come from? How could this possibly be? And this is kind of where I have this set of questions. What I come to is how in Mesopotamia, the research that I did on the first gardens that existed in Mesopotamia, there was this evolution of this idea of the word paradise, which came out of the idea of garden. I'm very interested if that's being taught in landscape schools, and the idea there, because it was the first time that this kind of evolution of the word, as I've understood and read it, is that it was the first time, about 5,000 years ago, that nature was controlled. So previously, before that, the river Euphrates would flood, the landscape would change, people would, everything would shift because nature was doing its process. And so I apologise for not remembering the name of the king that said, no, I want to build a wall to keep the river out. And it was the beginning of the very first fixed landscape. And that idea of a fixed landscape evolves into the idea of what paradise became. So in Persian and in Arabic, the evolution of the word paradise that's transformed into English comes from this idea of a walled garden. I'm interested in how that has been transported through landscape architecture, landscape design over time, and how that has transformed into what we have today. Also here it is, garden as boundary, boundary as paradise. There is some examples in Roman history of that I could find of this god called Terminus, that was the it was one of the gods that people would put a few rocks down and worship as kind of creating boundaries. So there's some history to it. I think I've talked about most of these ideas. One of my hypotheses was that landscape architecture, landscape design has actually been almost entirely taught in a bourgeois group of people. So it's a kind of a knowledge that's been handed down about these ideas of. It doesn't entirely seem to be the case, but it's these kind of knowledges that Adorno and Buddha write about how knowledge transfers. It's not often written down, but how it gets passed on, how it gets taught by the same group of people upon time. So I'd be interested in discussing that. And yes, most of the people I interviewed across all sorts of, from politics to all sorts of planning, etc., were unaware of the social and political history of these boundaries. However, I don't see this as a negative issue at all. I see it as kind of one of the greatest potentials in landscape design within London is the potential to look at these spaces again. To kind of, what does that space around the social housing block mean? What does that space that's been hyper-gentrified in Kensington mean? What does the spaces, the parks, what's the potential for those spaces if we could get beyond these ideas? And I think it can really, if there was a couple of projects that removed the fences, I think it would provoke a discussion around these kind of concepts of accessibility, permeability, etc. So
maybe this is the moment
yes,
to get
some feedback. Yeah.
Interaction, I think.
So these are the kind of questions that I had as a result of kind of only my research, but this is, you guys are studying this every day and teaching it every day and have been involved with it.
I mean, I'm wondering, Trenton, if this is the moment to bring Sam and Will and make it into a more
that would be great.
rounded discussion. That seem reasonable? Do you want to join? Yeah, you want to come and sit in the front. Sorry, I didn't mean to sort of